Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I've been a park ranger for over 10 years. I thought I'd seen everything. Lost hikers, wild animals, even the occasional criminal hiding out in the deep woods. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened in Blackwood National Park. It started like any other shift. The park was quiet, the early morning mist rolling over the tree line, and the distant sound of birds breaking the silence. I was stationed at Firewatch Tower 6, one of the oldest in the park, overlooking miles of dense forest. My only company was a static-filled radio, the occasional check-in from the other rangers, and the rustling of trees swaying in the wind. Peaceful. Around 6 a.m., a distress call came through my radio. It was Ranger Miller, stationed near the northern campgrounds. His voice was frantic, something I'd never heard from him before. "Dispatch, this is Miller. We need backup at North Camp. People are..." His voice cut out, replaced by static. I grabbed my rifle and radioed back. "Miller, come in. What's going on?" Silence. Then a single, garbled response. "They're biting?" Then nothing. The unease hit me immediately. Miller wasn't the type to joke around. I jumped in my truck and sped down the winding dirt roads toward the northern campgrounds. The morning light had barely cut through the trees, casting eerie shadows along the road. My gut told me something was very, very wrong. When I arrived, the place was a mess. Tents were ripped apart, supplies scattered everywhere, and there was no sign of the campers, except for one. A man stood in the center of the campground, his back turned to me. His clothes were torn, stained with something dark. His body swayed slightly, like he was barely able to stand. "Sir," I called out, stepping closer, "are you okay?" He turned slowly, and that's when I saw his face. Pale, eyes clouded, mouth slack but twitching. His skin looked wrong, like it had started to decay. Then he lunged. I barely had time to react before he was on me, his teeth snapping inches from my face. I shoved him back, sending him stumbling, but he didn't stop. He came at me again, groaning like an animal, arms reaching. I had no choice. I grabbed my rifle and fired. The shot echoed through the forest. The man dropped, but something in the trees stirred. Then I saw them. More figures, emerging from the woods, stumbling, moaning, their bodies twisted in unnatural ways. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't something I could report to dispatch. This was something else. Something unnatural. I stood there, frozen, my ears still ringing from the gunshot. The man, if you could still call him that, lay crumpled at my feet. But the sound had drawn attention. More figures staggered out of the trees. I counted 5 at first, then 7, then more than I could keep track of. Their faces were wrong. Gray, slack, eyes milky and unfocused. Their clothes were torn and stained, some missing shoes, some missing pieces of themselves. And they were heading right for me. I did the only thing I could. I ran. I bolted back to my truck, heart slamming against my ribs. I could hear them behind me, branches snapping, their strange guttural moans getting closer. My boots slipped on the damp forest floor, but I didn't stop. When I reached the truck, I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut just as one of them reached the window. Its face smashed against the glass, skin torn, teeth gnashing. My hands fumbled with the keys, shaking so badly I dropped them twice before finally jamming them into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I hit the gas. The truck tore down the dirt road, tires spitting up mud and gravel. In the rearview mirror, I saw them spilling out of the woods. Dozens of them now, maybe more. They didn't stop. They didn't even seem to tire. I grabbed my radio. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Hale. Something's happening at North Camp. We've got people attacking each other. They're sick, they're violent. Send help now." The only response was static. I tried calling the other towers, nothing. It was like I was completely cut off. That's when the road ahead of me ended. A fallen tree blocked the path, too big to drive over, too thick to go around. I slammed on the brakes, cursing. The woods were too dense here. I couldn't turn around. And those things were still coming. I grabbed my rifle and my pack, slinging them over my shoulder. If the truck couldn't get me out, my legs would have to. I took off into the forest, moving fast, trying to put as much distance between me and those things as possible. But the deeper I went, the worse it got. The forest was wrong. The usual sounds were gone. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just silence. And that silence was worse than the noise, because it felt like the whole park was holding its breath. Then I heard the screaming. It was coming from the direction of the old ranger station, an outpost we barely used anymore. I changed course, crashing through the underbrush. When I broke through the trees, I saw her. Ranger Morales, one of the newer recruits, was on the roof of the station, waving her arms. "Hale, up here!" she screamed. The station was surrounded. At least a dozen of those things pounded on the walls and windows, their fingers clawing at the wood. Some had already started climbing the porch railings. Morales fired down at them with her sidearm, but she was running out of bullets, and fast. I didn't think, I just acted. I raised my rifle and started firing. 2 dropped, then 3. But for every one that fell, more kept coming, dragging themselves out of the woods. "Hale, hurry!" Morales cried. I sprinted toward the station, reloading as I ran. A woman, I think it was a woman, lurched out from the side of the building, her face covered in blood. I didn't hesitate. 1 shot, and she went down. When I reached the porch, Morales dropped a rope ladder from the roof. I scrambled up, my muscles burning. Just as I pulled my legs up, the first of those things reached the bottom, clawing at the rungs. We were trapped. "What the hell is happening?" Morales gasped, her face pale. "I don't know," I said, catching my breath. "But we're not the only ones out here." We both looked out over the trees. In the distance, smoke rose from the southern campgrounds. And somewhere, far off, I heard a sound that chilled me to my core, the low, wailing moan of something that used to be human. We stayed on that roof for what felt like hours. The dead, or whatever they were, kept circling the station below us. Some of them slammed their fists against the walls. Others just stood there, staring up with those glassy, vacant eyes. But they weren't confused. They were patient. And that was worse. "We can't stay here," Morales whispered, her voice trembling. "They're not leaving." I know. I kept scanning the tree line, hoping for, I don't even know, reinforcements, rescue? But there was nothing. Just that rising column of smoke in the distance and the ever-present silence of the forest. We were on our own. "There's an outpost near the lake," I said finally. "About 5 miles west. It's got a radio tower. Maybe we can reach someone from there." Morales didn't look thrilled at the idea of hiking through the woods with those things everywhere, but she nodded. "We just have to get out of here first." I checked my rifle. Half a magazine left, and my sidearm. It wasn't much. Morales had even less. We'd have to make every shot count. "You ready?" I asked. "No," she said, "but let's go anyway." We climbed down the back of the station as quietly as we could. The dead were still clustered around the front, distracted by whatever was left inside. We hit the ground running, moving fast and low into the trees. The forest closed around us like a tunnel. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves felt like a warning. We didn't talk. We just ran. About a mile in, we found the first body. It was a camper, a young guy, maybe early 20s, lying face down in the dirt. His backpack had been shredded, and his arm, it was just gone. "Don't stop," I whispered, but Morales was already ahead of me. She crouched next to him, checking for any signs of life. When she rolled him over, his eyes opened. He lunged. I pulled her back, just as his teeth snapped shut where her hand had been. He scrambled toward us, his face twisted in a hungry, unnatural snarl. I didn't even think. I fired once, and he went still. Morales stared at the body, breathing hard. "They're everywhere," she whispered. "We keep moving," I said. "No stopping, no matter what." We pushed on, deeper into the forest. The sun climbed higher, but the light didn't make me feel any safer. The trees cast long, twisted shadows, and the quiet was starting to wear on me. That's when we heard the gunshots. 3 sharp cracks in the distance, then silence. "Survivors?" Morales asked. "Maybe," I said, but I didn't feel hopeful. We followed the sound. The trees started thinning out, and soon we reached the edge of the lake. The water stretched out in front of us, calm and undisturbed. But the dock was a nightmare. A group of people, maybe campers, maybe rangers, had made a last stand there. Their bodies lay in heaps, torn and broken. Some had weapons still clutched in their hands, and scattered among them were the dead. But some of those dead were still moving. One of them lifted its head, sniffing the air. It turned toward us with that awful, slow inevitability. The others followed. Then they started to run. "Go!" I shouted, and we sprinted back into the trees. The sound of them crashing through the underbrush behind us was deafening. I didn't know how many there were. I didn't want to look. The outpost was close. It had to be close. But the dead were faster than I expected. One of them burst out of the bushes on our left, and Morales fired, dropping it. But more kept coming. I saw the outpost ahead, just a small cabin with the radio tower rising above it, and I forced myself to run faster. The door was locked, of course. "Cover me," I shouted, digging through my pack for the keys. Morales fired behind me, 3 shots, then a click. She was out. "Hale, hurry!" The key turned. The door flew open and we tumbled inside, slamming it shut just as the first of the dead slammed into it from the other side. They hit the door again and again. The wood started to splinter. "We're not gonna make it," Morales whispered. "Get to the radio," I ordered. She ran to the console, flipping switches. Static filled the room, broken by occasional bursts of garbled voices. "Come on," she muttered, adjusting dials. "Somebody. Anybody?" The pounding grew louder, a window shattered, and a pale, bloodied hand reached through. Then the radio crackled. A voice came through, faint but clear. "Evacuation point. Ridgeway Visitor Center. Sunset." The signal cut out. "Did you hear that?" Morales asked. I nodded, but I wasn't sure we'd live long enough to reach it. The radio went dead, but those few words were enough to give us hope. "Evacuation point," Morales whispered. "Ridgeway Visitor Center. We have a chance." But the door wouldn't hold much longer. The dead pounded against it with relentless force, and the window was already half shattered. Fingers clawed through the broken glass, dragging jagged shards across the frame as they reached for us. "We need to go now," I said, slinging my pack over my shoulder. "Ridgeway's 10 miles out. If we move fast, we can make it before sunset." Morales' face was pale, but she nodded. "How do we get out of here?" "There's a back window," I said, "but once we're out, we'll have to run." "Again?" She tried to joke, but the fear in her voice broke through. "Again." We didn't wait. I pushed the back window open and we dropped into the clearing behind the outpost. The forest stretched ahead, quiet and still, but we knew better than to trust that silence. We ran. The sounds of the dead behind us faded, but we didn't slow down. Not for a second. The forest felt endless. Every tree looked the same, every path twisted and unfamiliar. I'd worked in this park for years, but the outbreak had turned it into something foreign and hostile. A few miles in, the air started to change. The scent of smoke drifted through the trees. I remembered the column of black we'd seen earlier and felt dread settle in my gut. "We should go around," Morales said, reading my mind. I nodded, but as we veered east we found more bodies. Campers, rangers, people we knew. They lay scattered across the forest floor, their faces pale and their eyes open and empty. But none of them moved. Not yet. We kept going. The sun rose higher, but its light did nothing to ease the cold grip of fear. Every sound felt like a warning. Every step felt too loud. At one point, we stopped to catch our breath. Morales leaned against a tree, wiping sweat from her forehead. "How much farther?" she asked. 5 miles, maybe 6, I said. "We're halfway there." A branch snapped behind us. We froze. I turned slowly, raising my rifle, but what stepped out of the trees wasn't one of the dead. It was a man, barely more than a teenager. His clothes were torn and his face was streaked with dirt and tears. He raised his hands when he saw us. "Please, don't shoot," he begged. I'm not one of them." Morales stepped forward cautiously. "Are you hurt?" "No, my family, we got separated." His voice cracked and he shook his head. "They were right behind me and then—" He never finished the sentence. The growling came from behind him. Before I could yell, 2 figures burst from the trees, running, fast and hungry. The boy barely had time to scream before they were on him. We ran. I hated myself for it, but there was nothing we could do. The sound of his screams followed us as we sprinted through the forest, and even when they stopped, I kept hearing them. The forest thinned out an hour later, and we reached the old service road leading towards Ridgeway. The pavement was cracked and overgrown, but it was a straight shot to the visitor center. "We're gonna make it," Morales said, almost daring to believe it. Then we saw the car. It was overturned in the middle of the road, its windows shattered and its frame scorched. Around it lay more bodies, but these were different. They were fresh. "Stay quiet," I whispered. We crept past the wreck, trying not to look too closely at the bodies, but halfway down the road one of them moved. A woman's head turned toward us, her mouth opening in a low, hungry moan. The others followed. "Run!" I shouted. We took off, the dead surging to their feet behind us. They were fast, faster than I thought they could be, and they didn't tire. The road stretched ahead, endless and unforgiving. Up ahead, Morales pointed. I saw it, the Ridgeway Visitor Center rising from the trees, its windows boarded up and its parking lot littered with abandoned cars. But there were lights inside. People. We were so close, but the dead were closer. One of them reached for me, and I spun, slamming my rifle butt into its face. Another lunged at Morales, and she shot it point blank, but there were too many. "Keep going," I shouted. "Get to the center. I'll hold them off." "I'm not leaving you," she cried. "Go." She hesitated, just for a second, then ran. I turned, raised my rifle, and fired. 2 fell, then 3. But I was running out of bullets and they didn't stop. My back hit the gate of the visitor center just as the last round left my rifle. The dead were almost on me. Then the gate opened. Inside, someone yelled. I dove through and the gate slammed shut behind me. Morales grabbed my arm, helping me to my feet. We made it, but the nightmare was far from over. The gate slammed shut with a metallic clang, and the dead crashed against it moments later. Their hands reached through the bars, clawing and grasping, but the gate held, at least for now. I turned, trying to catch my breath. The Ridgeway Visitor Center had been transformed into a fortress. Cars were stacked into makeshift barricades, windows were boarded up, and a watchtower had been rigged on top of the roof. Armed survivors patrolled the perimeter, their faces tired and wary. "You two okay?" A man stepped forward. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a rifle slung across his back. "Name's Fisher. I'm in charge here." "Ranger Hale," I said. "This is Morales. We heard the evacuation call." Fisher nodded. "You're lucky you made it. We haven't had many come through." "What's the plan?" Morales asked. "How are we getting out of here?" Fisher's face darkened. "Helicopter's supposed to come at sunset, but we haven't had contact for hours. If they don't show, we're on our own." I glanced at the gate. The dead were still there, more of them gathering every minute. We didn't have long. "Come inside," Fisher said. "Get some rest while you can." The interior of the visitor's center was crowded and tense. Families huddled in corners, their faces pale and frightened. Others sat cleaning weapons or staring blankly at nothing. The air was thick with fear and exhaustion. Morales and I found a quiet spot near the back. Neither of us spoke for a while. "You think that chopper's coming?" she asked finally. I wanted to lie. I wanted to tell her everything would be fine, but I couldn't. "I don't know," I admitted. "But if it doesn't, we'll find another way." She nodded, but the doubt was clear in her eyes. A scream shattered the quiet. We jumped to our feet as chaos erupted near the front entrance. A man stumbled backward, clutching his arm. Blood poured between his fingers. "He's been bit," someone shouted. Panic spread like wildfire. People backed away, eyes wide with fear. Fisher pushed through the crowd, his face hard. "Show me," he demanded. The man shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "It's not, I'm fine." But when he pulled his hand away, we saw the bite. Deep, ugly, already turning black around the edges. Fisher's expression didn't change. "You know what happens next." "Please," the man begged. I have a family. I'm sorry." Fisher raised his gun. "Wait," Morales stepped forward. "There's got to be another way." "There isn't," Fisher said. "You've seen what happens." I put a hand on Morales' shoulder. I hated it. But Fisher was right. We couldn't take the risk. The shot rang out. The room fell silent. After that, the tension only grew worse. Sunset was approaching, and there was still no word from the helicopter. The dead outside grew louder, their numbers swelling. The gate shuddered under their weight. "We won't hold out much longer," Fisher said quietly. And then we heard it. The low, distant thump of helicopter rotors. People surged toward the windows, hope breaking through the fear. A black dot appeared on the horizon, growing larger as it approached. But the dead heard it too. They pressed harder against the gate, driven into a frenzy. Metal groaned and bent. The barricade wouldn't last. "Everyone to the roof," Fisher shouted. "Move!" We ran. The helicopter circled, looking for a place to land, but there was no clear space. The lot was overrun. The pilot's voice crackled over a handheld radio. "Too many hostiles on the ground. We can't land." "Then what do we do?" Fisher shouted. "Get to high ground. We'll drop a line." The roof. It was our only chance. But the gate below finally gave way. The dead poured through. The gate gave way with a screech of twisting metal. The dead surged into the visitors' center grounds like a flood, relentless, unstoppable. Their moans rose into a terrible chorus that drowned out the panicked shouts of the survivors. "Get to the roof," Fisher bellowed, firing into the horde. "Move, move, move." We ran. Morales stayed close, her face pale but determined. The narrow stairwell to the roof became a bottleneck. People pushed and shoved, driven by fear. I heard shots behind us, screams cut short. "Don't stop," I urged, shoving someone forward. We burst onto the roof just as the helicopter swept overhead. The sound of its rotors was deafening, stirring the air into a violent gust. The side door slid open, and a soldier leaned out, waving. "Ropes coming down," his voice crackled through Fisher's radio. A long rescue line dropped, swaying in the wind. But there were too many of us, and not enough time. "They're coming up the stairs," someone screamed. I spun toward the stairwell, just as the first of the dead forced its way through. Fisher's people fired, dropping them, but more kept coming. They spilled onto the roof, hungry and fast. "Grab the line," Fisher ordered. "Go, go!" The first group, mostly children and their parents, clung to the rope, and the helicopter began to lift. I covered them, my rifle barking out shots. Morales fired beside me until her gun clicked empty. "They're not gonna make it," she said, her voice breaking. "There's too many." The helicopter banked, dropping the line again. More people grabbed on, too many at once. The rope strained under the weight. "We're out of time," Fisher shouted. "One more lift. After that, they're gone." Morales turned to me. "You go," she said. "Not a chance," I shot back. The dead were everywhere now. Fisher's people were being overwhelmed, their screams cutting through the chaos. "Go," she yelled, shoving me toward the line. "Not without you." I grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the rope. But before we could reach it, Fisher went down. A dozen hands dragged him to the ground, and his gunfire turned to screams. The sight froze me in place. And that's when they hit us. A wall of bodies crashed into us. I lost Morales in the chaos. "Morales!" I shouted, but I couldn't see her. The helicopter's line was rising again, its final lift. I fought my way toward it, teeth snapping inches from my face. My knife found its mark again and again, but there were too many. The rope was lifting, just out of reach. And then I saw her. Morales was running, her face bloodied, her eyes wide with terror. The rope was already rising. She wouldn't make it. Without thinking, I ran for her. I grabbed her hand and boosted her upward. She caught the rope, barely, her fingers clutching tight. "Hale!" she screamed. "Jump!" But the dead had me. Their hands clawed at my arms, my legs. The rope was rising, too far. "Go!" I shouted. "You have to go. I'm not leaving you." The helicopter jerked upward. The rope was almost out of reach. I leaped, desperation giving me strength, and my hand caught hers. "Hold on," she cried. The dead fell away beneath us as the helicopter rose, their hands stretching towards the sky. The ground became a sea of bodies, their faces twisted with hunger and rage. We climbed the rope slowly, my muscles burning. Morales held on, her knuckles white. When we finally reached the open door, strong hands pulled us inside. The cabin was crowded. Too many people, not enough space, but we were alive. I collapsed against the wall, my chest heaving. Morales sat beside me, her face streaked with sweat and tears. "We made it," she whispered. For the first time in hours, I let myself believe it. The helicopter banked toward the horizon, the burning forest and the Ridgeway Visitors Center shrinking behind us. The dead were still down there, and the world we knew was gone. But we were still breathing, and as long as we were alive, there was hope. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.